Hello, everyone. As promised, I'm here to deliver the final reflection on the principles for building resilience. I'm referring to Chapter 10, which has the title Reflections on Building Resilience, Interactions Among Principles and Implications for Governance. That's a fine description of what this chapter is about. And I will not go into the interconnections, the interdependencies among the different principles. As you might imagine, that is a very complex topic. When you attempt to follow a principle into reality and measure its effect, given that the six other principles, there's seven in total, given that the other six principles are also, in theory, active and interdependent, any single principle, the effect that it has, will be modified or affected to some degree by the other principles. So to make a long story short, and they're very honest about this in the final chapter, there are all sorts of serious problems with measurement here, not only with respect to the measured effect of a given principle, but more to the measured effect of all principles at once. In other words, if you face this as a measurement issue, how do you know after you've conducted your measurement which principle is effective? Which principle is at play? Which principle is the most influential? You would have to somehow control for the confounding variables that sit inside the other principles. So I don't mean to complicate this. It is just that from a measurement point of view, when you go out and look to trace the effect of a given principle or two or three principles or all seven, you will face all sorts of very serious problems in measurement. Now, are these insurmountable challenges? There's no reason to believe they're insurmountable, but it may take us decades to figure out how to measure these principles, to measure their effect. Do they, in fact, deliver greater resiliency or greater resilience to the system in question, whether it's a social ecological system or some other kind of system? So I just want to make that clear. In other words, this approach is very much under development. I think that might be the best way to put it. Does it hold promise? Yes, of course it holds promise. It faces, in the context of natural resources management or ecosystem services management, take whichever term you prefer, and there is a difference, but I think it might be a difference of nuance more than anything else. Take a look at the extent of the challenges we face in managing ecosystem services. It's difficult to even describe the magnitude of that challenge. So what we have in the principles is we have a pretty elaborate set of principles to guide us in the management of certain systems, in this case, ecosystem services, right? So there's one major conceptual point I wanted to raise here. I think it's critical. To a degree, I hesitate to bring it up because I'm not quite certain I have understood it. And as soon as I finish grading the papers, I'm going to turn to the first two chapters of this book myself and read them again. I at times feel I must be missing something. So I will do that, but for now, I'm going to proceed with the view that I have. And the view that I have concerns, I can bring it up in reference to the very first sentence of this chapter. I brought it up before, and I'm about to bring it up again. This book, I'm quoting the very first sentence. This book synthesizes and reviews the evidence in support of 7 generic principles for enhancing the resilience of ecosystem services. Now, stop there. For enhancing the resilience of ecosystem services, comma, i.e., that is, the capacity of a social ecological system to sustain a desired set of ecosystem services in the face of disturbance and ongoing change. Now, by now, that phraseology should be familiar to us. They use it all of the time in this text. But it contains something that troubles me. And I'll do my best to explain it in simple terms. Look at what this sentence says. And there's another example in this chapter. It says that we have these 7 generic principles for enhancing the resilience of ecosystem services. That is, the capacity of social ecological systems to sustain a desired set of ecosystem services. So in other words, the resilience of the ecosystem service is itself a capacity of the SES. So here's my question. I've raised it before. If you look at resilience as a general property of systems, is it a property of the ecosystem, or is it a property of the social ecological system? These are 2 different systems. So why would they share the same property, right? What does it mean to say an ecosystem is resilient? I think what it means is that that system, and let's take an example, a lake, a pond, that system has its own inner resilience, its own capacity to respond to change, to adapt to change. It's part of what it means to be a complex adaptive system. You don't need a governance board. You don't need a leadership of any kind. The ecosystem has its own resilience. It's a property of that natural system. Now, what this says is that it's not a property of the ecosystem service. It's a property of the social ecological system. The resilience is the capacity of the SES to sustain a desired set of ecosystem services. My Lord, I can't read. In any case, I hope you see where I'm going with this. Let me go down the page about 6 or 7 lines, and I'll read this. It's quite similar. The nature of social ecological systems is interdependent, complex adaptive systems, calls for governance and management that enhances aspects of a social ecological system. Right. So here it would appear once again that resilience, the ability to adapt within a social ecological system, is itself a property of that system. So again, I raise the question, resilience is a property or a characteristic. What is it a property of? Well, it would appear to be a property of the ecosystem, not the service, but the ecosystem itself. So that is a proper attribution of the property of resilience to a natural system. And if you look at this text, this chapter, they several times take the property of resilience and ascribe it to ecosystems. Most often, however, they ascribe it to the SES, to the social ecological system. So it still, for me, is a quandary, a conundrum. We have this property, resilience. We have 7 principles that are supposed to generate resilience, that are supposed to give rise to this property. And yet, what is it a property of? So I don't know that this text has ever been clear on that very simple point. Now, as I said, I'm going to reread the first 2 chapters of this book and try to figure out what the hell they're trying to say, because it should be very clear, but I've struggled to find the clarity here. So if any of you have a good theory here, a good explanation of how resilience applies to both the ecosystem and the social ecological system, let me know. And keep in mind, there may be 2 kinds of resilience here, right? That's what I suspect. Why? Why would you ever expect the resilience of a natural system to be identical to the resilience of a human system, right? Why would you ever expect that to be true? We should be able to see the difference, I think, unless I'm wrong here. The paradigmatic example of a CAS is the anthill. Now, what's lacking in the anthill? The 7 principles of resilience. Ants are very resilient, and they have no principles. They don't need them, right? That's what I mean. It's an inner property of the CAS, right? You don't have to teach a CAS to be resilient. Resilience is an internal property of any CAS. And in fact, it's from studying the theoretical model of the CAS in relation to instances in nature, natural systems. Much of this stems from natural resources management, the whole discussion of resilience. You can see that in all over this text, right? So my point is, there seems to be a confusion from the first page to the last over what resilience is. When we ascribe it to natural systems, to bona fide CASs, these are complex adaptive systems, no question. When we apply the term resilience to describe them, are we using that term in the same sense that we use it when we turn to human systems? And any social ecological system is a human system, I think, by definition. So that question still looms large. Now, here's my big question for you. There are 2 fields, I mentioned this in the reflection yesterday, I think. There are 2 fields in which this approach has taken hold. One is natural resources management, and we can see it here. And the other is community development. So if you read the literature on resilience outside of this text, you will find references to community development. Now, why? It should be obvious. What happens in this case? Multiple players, multiple levels, multiple scales, all sorts of complexity, emergence, curvilinear causality, loops, all sorts of things. And guess where else you'll run into the same types of challenges, the same types of considerations in community development, right? Now, this is your field, not mine. So correct me if I go wrong, but in any substantial project in community development, I would imagine, and again, correct me if I go wrong here, you have multiple actors, multiple avenues of causality, all sorts of interdependencies, emergence, of course, if we're talking about human systems, we are not predictable. So, and as I keep saying, our frontal lobes get in the way all of the time and create all sorts of havoc for us. So these are human systems. A social ecological system is a human system. Now, I want to read one more case, one more example of this. It's on 252. I quote, "We have focused specifically on generic principles for enhancing the resilience of ecosystem services, comma, which we define." Now that which refers to the resilience of ecosystem services. The way this sentence is written, that which is a pronoun. It's a relative pronoun, and it refers back to the phrase, the resilience of ecosystem services. Now, so which we define as the capacity of an SES to sustain a desired set of ecosystem services in the face of disturbance and ongoing change. So there we go again. In other words, we're going to say that the resilience of the ecosystem in question is the capacity of the SES. Now think about that. I was just arguing a CAS, if we're talking about a natural system, an ecosystem, it has its own resilience, right? That's where all of this comes from, in the sense that it comes from studying ecosystems. It is ecosystems that reflect the principles of resilience. And I think that's obvious. Interconnection, connectivity, for example, is a feature of a CAS. Not all of the principles are, by the way. I would argue that learning is, I think that's principle 5. Learning is not a property of ecosystem services, not in the same sense. You can say ecosystem services learn in some perhaps odd or extended sense, but when you say social ecological systems learn, you're talking about human beings learning, right? And that's learning that we have some understanding of and we can describe. The way ecosystems learn, that's not at all clear to us, right? So I would raise that the same point yet again, which this property, resilience, what does it describe? Does it describe both the CAS and the SES? And if so, does it describe them in the same way? These are theoretical issues, by the way, not empirical ones. And I still think this is a challenge for these authors. Now, again, I'm going to check on my own thinking. But so far as I can see, this has not been clarified, and it sits at the very heart of the entire enterprise. So in my view, it's not a minor issue. It's a fundamental issue. You're talking about resilience. What does it describe? There are two possibilities, and they're very different. So which is it? The book should come right out and tell us it's A or B or both, right? So I wanted to make that point because I think the book never quite addresses it. And I think it's a bit of a problem. You can tell. I'm looking for something else to say about the chapter. I have one more point I wanted to make. You'll even see in this chapter, by the way, references to the resilience of ecosystem services and references to the resilience of the SES. So both are described as resilient. Now, let me find my little section here that I wanted to talk about. Where did it go? Where did it go? Where did it go? Because it was an important point. And guess what? Here it is. Now, part of the reason why this is related to the point I made about measurement a few minutes ago. The reason why they're having problems measuring is, if you've ever done this, you would know, measurement is one thing. Constructing the measurement is an entirely different thing. And what I mean by that is, if you set out to measure something called resilience, you better have a very clear construct in your mind. And by construct, I mean something like a model, right? So what is it you mean by resilience? So spell that out in specific detail. Without the detail, our measurements will not be on target. We will suffer from unreliability, lack of validity, lack of accuracy. The measurement, in short, is only as good as the theoretical construct upon which it's based, right? We never measure in a vacuum. We always measure under a construct. And if our construct is feeble, if our construct is foggy, we will proceed without any clear idea of what we're supposed to be measuring. And our measurements might even be dangerous, right? Because if they're not grounded in a complete construct, they could indicate just about anything, right? So we have to be very careful when it comes to measurements. And they admit that they have serious measurement problems. But I suspect a fair number of their measurement problems are a direct result of their conceptual problems. So, and they're quite candid about this. So I don't want to sound like I'm sniping from behind the bushes. These authors have been very honest about where they are. So I think we owe them the respect that goes with recognizing their honesty, because they don't try to pull the wool over our eyes. They recognize that this approach needs an awful lot of work. Now, I was going to raise, I just closed the book. Here's my big question for you. As I mentioned a short while ago, this approach has two homes. One is natural resources management, the other is community development. You do community development. It's your work, it's your life. You tell me, look at those 7 principles. Do you think they're relevant to community development? I'm not suggesting they're not. I'm asking you point blank. Do you think these principles, given that they're supposed to, in theory anyhow, apply to the world of community development, how well would you say they apply? Right? If you look at them briefly, which I will do here, I'll just take an example. Foster complex adaptive systems thinking. Well, that's a principle. It's principle number 4. And complex adaptive systems thinking, that's what they called it, is something we're aware of. We've seen it before, Professor Laporte discussed it with you, complex or systems thinking anyhow. Complex adaptive systems thinking is very much the same thing. Now, is that required in community development? Well, it depends, I suppose, on the nature of the project or the initiative. It might well be applicable in the sense that in community development, with the different scales, layers, jurisdictions, players, actors, influencers, all of that would require an approach that sees the community itself as a system. So that principle might seem to apply. Let's take another one. And that will be the last one I take up, because I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. And on Thursday, I hope I can raise this question. So if you hear this before Thursday, give it some thought. Now, I would note in closing, the authors do say in here, I won't bring up the quotation, but they come right out and say, we need to pay attention to politics. Because I keep bringing politics up because it's not in a CAS. There's no political reality in a CAS. Not in the case of ecosystems, right? There are no politicians in a pond. Thank God. Otherwise, they'd be much less pleasant than they are. In any case, so encourage learning. Well, I can't imagine any kind of initiative in which you would not want to encourage learning. But certainly in the case of community development, it seems to me that you would. Connectivity, that seems to apply in a broad and rather loose sense. Managing slow variables and feedback, that might apply too. So on the surface, it would appear that the resilience approach might well suit or be conducive to community development. So I'd love to hear your thinking on that. I'm tempted even to write an assignment on it. It's, I think, a very important question, but I'd rather that we just discuss it at some point. So with that said, I don't think I have anything further to say on principles. I will go back to it. I want you to know that. I will go back to it because I'm not satisfied that I've understood it. And when I say it, I mean the big conceptual issue that I described a few minutes ago. So with that, I'm grading the papers. I gave you a little reflection today on that. I'll be doing more of that tomorrow. I hope to surface at some point soon. So anyhow, thanks for the papers. Thanks for the work. And I'll keep plugging away. So have a good evening. Bye.